pregnant and cast out in a killing blizzard. A Lakota chief sheltered her and her unborn babe. The fire had burned low by the time my son Chayton woke me. He did not say a word. He stood at the entrance to my tipi with the hide pulled back and the wind coming in off the flats, and he just looked at me. That was enough. 22 years old, and already he'd learned that some things you don't explain, you just show a man and let him decide. I pulled on my elk hide shirt and my leggings, and I followed him out into the dark. It was the kind of cold that has a sound to it, a low pressure, like the world holding its breath before it hits you. The snow was coming sideways off the hills to the northwest, the kind that doesn't fall so much as drive, horizontal and fine-grained, gets inside everything, fills the creases of your face before you've taken 3 steps. My horse Shunka had his head down in the enclosure and wouldn't look at me. Animals know. Chayton pointed east along the tree line. I couldn't see anything at first, just the dark and the snow and the line of cottonwoods bending in the wind. Then I made out a shape against the base of one of the trunks, low to the ground, slumped. I thought it was a deer at first. That's the truth of it. A deer that had come down out of the hills and found the trees and laid down to wait out the storm. We walked toward it and the wind shifted and I could smell it, not an animal smell. Wool. Wet wool and something underneath it, something copper and clothes. Blood. It was a woman. White woman. Young. Couldn't have been more than 20 years old, maybe less, hard to say, with her face half buried in the crook of her arm. She was curled around herself the way you do when you are trying to keep one flame alive and everything around you is trying to put it out. Her dress was soaked through. No coat. Thin leather boots already stiff with ice. She'd tied a piece of blanket around her shoulders, one of those trade blankets, blue and red, and it was more ice than wool by then. And she was with child, far along. 6 months, maybe 7, hard to tell the way she was curled. But you could see it even through the layers. Chayton looked at me, I looked at her. I put 2 fingers against the side of her throat. Pulse there, but thin. Like a thread pulled too tight. Her lips had gone a color that lips shouldn't be. I worked one hand under her and lifted her head, and she made a sound, not a word, not a cry, just a sound from somewhere deep. The kind of sound a person makes when they are too far gone to be frightened anymore and too close to something to stop moving toward it. I told Chayton to get 2 strikes. He went at a run. I pulled off my elk hide shirt, had a buffalo robe underneath, the thick one I'd taken 3 winters ago, still heavy with grease and warmth, and I wrapped it around her. Then I sat down in the snow behind the cottonwood trunk to block the wind, and I held her against me. Just held her. Because there was nothing else to do right then, and because she was going to die if I let her stay cold for the 30 seconds, it took Chayton to get 2 strikes. 2 strikes is our medicine man. Old. Older than anyone knows, including him. He came out of the dark with his bag over his shoulder and a burning stick in his hand for light, and he crouched down and looked at her for a long time without touching her. Then he touched her hands, her feet, the side of her face. He stood up and looked at me, and he said what I already knew. Bring her in. My tipi was the largest in camp. I was chief. That is not vanity, it was practical. There were things that happened in that space, decisions made, medicine stored, men brought when they were hurt. It had room. I carried her in and laid her on the sleeping robes near the center fire, and 2 strikes went to work. I stood outside. Not because I was told to. Because there are things a man doesn't insert himself into. 2 strikes had 2 of the women with him, Winona and my sister Hanska, and they knew what to do with a woman in that condition, and I did not. So I stood outside in the snow, and I sent Chayton to add wood to the fire, and I waited. The camp was quiet around me, most people still asleep, a few dogs moving in the dark. The wind had backed around to the north, and the temperature was dropping. I could feel it in my back teeth, that particular cold that comes when a storm means what it says. I thought about who she was, where she'd come from. There was a settlement 2 days' ride east, maybe a day and a half if you pushed it in good weather. A thin scattering of buildings they called a town, a trading post, a few homesteads, a church. I'd been there twice years ago when things were different and men talked to each other more easily. I knew what the people there thought of us. I had no illusions about that. But I also knew that a woman doesn't walk out of a settlement in the middle of a killing blizzard because she felt like a walk. She walks out because something worse was waiting inside. Hanska came out after a long time and told me she was alive, that the baby was still alive, that she was sleeping. I nodded. Hanska stood there a moment. She is 4 years younger than me and she has never been shy about saying what she thinks. She said, "Some of the men are asking." I said, "Let them ask." She went back inside. I stayed outside until the fire in my chest settled down to something manageable. Then I went to check the horses. She slept for nearly 2 days. 2 strikes had given her something. I didn't ask what. I never ask what. I just trust him the way you trust a river to know where it's going. She ran a fever the first night that had 2 strikes sitting beside her the whole time, and Winona too, and I slept in my son's tippy and did not sleep well. Twice in that first night I heard 2 strikes working, low voices, the scrape of something against the bowl he used for medicine work, the smell of something burning that I didn't know the name of. Once I heard one of the women say something urgent, and then it went quiet and stayed quiet, and I lay there in the dark listening to the quiet the way you listen to a silence that might mean something. The second morning I came in to speak with 2 strikes, and she was awake. She was propped up on the sleeping robes with a buffalo robe across her lap, and she was looking at the smoke hole. Not at me. At the smoke hole. The way a person looks at the sky when they're trying to find where they are. I sat down across the fire from her because that is the polite distance. She finally looked at me. Her eyes were gray. The kind of gray that isn't one color, changes with what the light does. I said in English, "You are safe." She closed her eyes for a second. Then she opened them and she said, very quietly, "I didn't think I was going to be." Her name was Clara Marsh, from the settlement east of us. Her husband had been a man named Deacon Marsh. She said the name the way you say the name of a storm that already happened, flat and factual, past tense. He had been a big man, she said, well thought of in the settlement, had land, had standing, had a temper he kept hidden until the door was closed. She told me this over 3 or 4 days, piece by piece, the way a person tells a thing they've only just gotten permission to say. Not all at once, not in a flood. She'd say a part of it and then be quiet and watch the fire and then maybe say another piece when she was ready. Sometimes she'd start something and then stop and I'd wait and she'd find the thread again or she wouldn't, and either way I didn't push. I've noticed that people tell you important things sideways. They tell you the edge of it first and they watch to see what you do with the edge, and if you don't do anything terrible with it they give you a little more. That's how trust works, not a declaration, a series of small testings. I sat across the fire from her and I let her test. What I understood from all the pieces, the child wasn't Deacon Marsh's. She stopped herself before she finished that sentence twice. I didn't ask her to finish it. What she said was, "He found out. He told the preacher and the preacher told the congregation and the congregation decided. They gave her 1 night to be out of the settlement. They gave her a blanket and 1 day's food and they put her on the road and they didn't look back. In a blizzard. With a child 6 months along. I'm not going to say what I felt when I understood that fully. I don't think I have the right words for it in English and I'm not sure the words exist in Lakota either. There is a kind of anger that is so clean and so cold it doesn't feel like anger at all. It feels like clarity. Like you can see everything very clearly all at once. What a thing is, what it deserves, what you are going to do about it. What I was going to do about it was simple. She was staying until the child came and until she was strong enough to decide what came next. That was all. That was the whole of it. She looked at me when I told her that and she said, "You don't know me." I said, "I know enough." She looked at the fire for a while. Then she said, "I don't know why you're doing this." I said, you don't need to know why yet. You need to eat something and sleep. She almost said something else. Then she didn't. She lay back down on the robe and I went out and told Winona to bring her broth when she woke, and that was the beginning of it. The camp had opinions. Of course it did. A camp of 60 people in a hard winter with food running thin. When something happens that wasn't planned for, people have opinions. That is their right. I've been chief of this band for 11 years, and I have never once expected everyone to agree with me. I just expect them to say what they think to my face, and then abide by what's decided. Straight Bo came to me 3 days after Clara arrived. Straight Bo is a good man. One of the best hunters I have. His family was hungry last winter and he has not forgotten it, and he was looking at this white woman in my tipi, and he was doing arithmetic in his head about the food we had and the mouths we were feeding and the weeks until spring. He sat down with me and he was respectful about it. He said, "She is not one of us." I said she was in the snow. He said, "There are many things in the snow." I looked at him. He held the look for a moment and then he looked away. Not because I frightened him, Straight Bo doesn't frighten easily, but because he knew I'd already decided, and he was a man who respected decisions made cleanly. He said, "And when the men from the settlement come looking for her?" I said, "Let them come." He was quiet a moment. Then he said, and there was something different in his voice when he said it, something almost careful, "You are going to stand for this woman." I said, "I am going to stand for what I stand for." He thought about that. Then he nodded once and he got up and he left. And he never raised the question again, not to me, not that I heard of to anyone else. That was the kind of man Straight Bo was. You could say things to each other clean and then it was done. 2 nights later, Chayton came and sat with me. He's a good boy. A good man, I should say. He's been a man for 3 years now, done his Hamblesaya, carried himself well. But he is still my son, and there is a version of his face I have known since he was 4 years old that I still see sometimes when the light is right. He sat across the fire from me, and he was quiet for a while, and then he said, "Father, do you know what people are saying?" I said, "Tell me." He said they were saying I'd taken the white woman for myself, that she was going to be my second wife, that this was why I'd brought her in and why I was letting her stay. I looked at the fire. He said, "I told them that wasn't true." I said, "Good, because it isn't." He said, "Then why?" And I thought about how to answer that for a long time, because the true answer is the kind that sounds simple when you say it and lands different when you live it. I said, "Because I found her in the snow and she was alive and I had a choice." That's the whole of it. When you have a choice that clear, you don't need a reason. You just make the choice and then you are the man who made it, and you live with that. He thought about that for a while, then he said, "She is very quiet." I said, "She has been through something." He said, "She watches you." I didn't say anything to that. She did watch me. I noticed it, but I didn't make anything of it. She was in a strange place, surrounded by strange people in a strange language, and I was the one person who'd spoken to her in her own tongue. It made sense that she'd watch me. You watch the thing that is your point of reference when everything else is unfamiliar. What I watched was the way she got her feet under her. Because she did. Not fast, she was still weak, still running a low heat in her blood that 2 strikes watched carefully, and the baby was pressing heavy now and she moved slowly. But she moved. A week after I brought her and she asked Winona to teach her some words. Winona came and told me this with a look on her face I couldn't quite read. She's a woman who has 3 expressions and uses all of them for 40 different things. She said, "The white woman wants to learn." I said, "Teach her." 2 weeks in, Clara was helping with the meat drying. Slow work, sitting work, but she did it. Her hands learned what to do and she did it without complaint. The women watched her at first the way you watch something you don't know if you can trust yet, careful and not unkind but careful. Then something shifted. I don't know exactly when. One afternoon I walked past the drying racks and Clara was laughing at something Hanska had done, not politely laughing, really laughing, surprised out of herself, and Hanska was trying to look dignified and failing. I kept walking, but I noticed. I noticed other things too. The way she thanked Winona every time Winona brought food, not with words at first, because she didn't have the words, but with her eyes and a small inclination of her head that was so sincere it came through without language. Winona is not a soft woman. She's seen 40 winters and buried 2 children, and she does not warm to people quickly. By the 3rd week she was sitting near Clara in the afternoons and teaching her to sew the right way, showing her the particular angle of the awl and how to pull the sinew through without tearing. Clara made mistakes and Winona corrected them without impatience, and Clara didn't argue, just corrected and tried again. There was a boy in the camp, Mato's youngest, who kept coming to sit near Clara in the afternoons. 7 years old, curious as a crow. He'd sit close and stare at her belly and then look up at her face and then back at her belly. Clara started talking to him even though he didn't understand a word. Just talking, slow and easy, showing him things with her hands. He'd nod like he understood everything. After a while he started bringing her things, a good stone he'd found, a piece of antler, a bit of ribbon somebody had traded for somewhere. She kept them all. She had a small pile of them on the robe beside her sleeping place. I'm telling you these things because they matter. Because the way a person earns their place in a community isn't a single moment. It's 100 small ones. And I watched her earn them one at a time without asking anyone's permission or approval, just doing the next thing that was in front of her. And I think I respected her for it more than I'd have been able to say at the time. I also talked to her more than I'd expected to. In the evenings, when the camp was settling and the fire had burned down to coals and there was nothing urgent to do, I'd sit near the entrance of my tipi on the cold side and she'd be on the warm side and we'd talk. Slowly at first. But the slow way isn't always the shallow way. Sometimes it's the opposite. She asked me things about the land, about the animals, about how I knew what I knew. She listened to the answers without interrupting, which is rarer than you'd think. She had a way of sitting that was very still, the way you sit when you're actually taking something in rather than waiting for your turn to speak. She asked me once, "How long have you been chief?" I said 11 years. She said, "Do you like it?" I said, "It's not a thing you like or don't like. It's a thing you are or aren't." She thought about that. Then she said, "My father was like that about farming. He'd say it's not what I do, it's what I am." I said, "Your father sounds like he understood something." She said he did. He died when I was 12. After that I understood less. She said it plainly, without self-pity, just as a fact. I didn't offer condolences because that's not what that kind of statement is asking for. We just sat with it for a while and then talked about something else. One night she said, "Do you ever get tired of being the one who decides?" I was quiet a while, then I said, "Sometimes. But the tired is different from the thing. The tired doesn't change what the thing is." She said, "No, I suppose it doesn't." She was quiet for a bit. Then she said, "You said something to me the first day. You said you knew enough about me. Do you remember?" I said, "I remember." She said, "I've been thinking about that. What did you know?" I said, "I knew you walked out into a blizzard without a coat rather than stay. That tells a person something about what they were walking away from and something about what they're made of." She was still for a long time after that. Then she said, "Nobody has ever said that to me before." I said, "What did they say?" She said, "Nothing, mostly nothing." The men from the settlement came on the 31st day. I knew they were coming before I heard them. Not prophecy, just reading. The sky to the east had a quality to it in the morning, a kind of flat gray that felt occupied. And Shunka had been restless since before dawn, pawing and turning in the enclosure, and he is a horse who reads things accurately. I told Chayton to stay in camp. I told Straight Bow to keep the younger men back. Then I went to the edge of camp and I waited. There were 4 of them. I watched them come from a long way off. You can see a long way here when the storm has passed and the light is flat. They were on horses that hadn't been cared for well, too thin, poorly shod for the snow. The men themselves were dressed for cold but not for this cold, and two of them were already hunched over their saddles by the time they got close. They'd been riding a while and they were cold, and they were unhappy, and unhappy cold men make particular kinds of mistakes. The one in front was big, dark-coated, dark-hatted, sat his horse like a man who is used to being the largest thing in any room, wide in the shoulders, a black beard with some gray in it. He had the look of a man who has always gotten things by being bigger than the thing he wanted them from, and who hasn't yet run into a situation that changed his method. He pulled up his horse 20 feet from me and looked at me for a long moment. Then he said in English, "We're looking for a woman, white woman. She came this way." I said, "I know who you are looking for." He said, "Then you know we've come to take her back." I said, "She is not something you take." He sat back slightly in his saddle. He wasn't used to being answered that way. I could see him deciding what to do with it. There was a moment where he considered several approaches and settled on the one that had always worked before, which was authority of tone. He said, "She's the wife of one of our men. That makes her our business." I said, "She walked out of your settlement in a blizzard with no coat. Your business with her is done." The man beside him, younger, with red showing in his beard, said something under his breath. I didn't catch the words, but I caught the register. The big man glanced at him. I said, "You are cold. Your horses are tired. There is a fire at the edge of camp, and you may warm yourselves and water your horses before you go back." The big man looked at me. He said, "We're not leaving without her." I looked at him for a long time. I am not a man who fills silence. Silence is not empty, it's where things settle, where you find out what something actually is. I let it settle. Then I said, "Yes, you are." And something in my voice, or maybe something he read in my face, or maybe just the fact that there were men behind me he could see and men in the camp he couldn't see that he could sense, something made him stop. He sat there in the cold, and the steam came off his horse, and he looked at me, and then he looked past me at the camp, and then he looked at the sky like it was going to tell him something useful. He said, "She's carrying a bastard child, and she's shamed her husband and our whole congregation, and you're sheltering her." I said, "I am." He said, "Why?" I said, "Because she was in the snow and she was alive." He said, "That's no reason to make this your business." I said, "I decide what is my business." He held that. He didn't like it. A man like that, someone who has built his whole self around being the authority in the room, around being the one whose word is the last word, when he meets something immovable, it doesn't make him back down right away. It makes him look for an angle. His eyes went over my shoulder at the camp behind me. I watched him count what he could see and estimate what he couldn't, and I watched him do the arithmetic. He said, "The Lord's law doesn't change just because we're out here on the frontier." I said, "No, but yours does." He looked at me. I said, "The law you're describing sent a pregnant woman into a blizzard to die. Whatever Lord's law you're talking about, that's not it. That's just men with a book and a grudge. I know the difference." The red-bearded younger one said something sharp. The big man put up one hand without looking at him, and the younger one went quiet. The big man looked at me, and he was very still, and I held the stillness with him, and neither of us looked away. Then he turned his horse, slowly. The other three turned without a word. The red-bearded one took a moment, wanted to hold something, then turned too. I watched them go back east until the snow closed behind them. I watched them a long time after I couldn't see them anymore, just to be sure. I stayed standing there a while after they were gone. Chayton came and stood beside me. He said, "You think they'll come back?" I said, "No." He said, "How do you know?" I said, "Because that man made a decision and he knows it. He'll go home and he'll tell people what happened, and the telling will be different from what happened, but underneath it he'll know, and he'll stay home." Chayton was quiet a moment, Then he said, "Were you afraid?" I said, "Of what?" He said, "Of them, of what they might do." I looked east at where they'd gone. I said, "I was afraid of what would happen if I wasn't standing there, but that's a different thing." He thought about that. "He's a good thinker, my son," he said. Clara heard. I said, "Did she?" He said, "Hanska was with her." She said Clara didn't say anything. She just sat there. But after they rode off, she said, he paused. He said, she said, "I knew he would." I said, "Knew I would what?" He said Hanska asked her the same thing. Clara said, "Stand there." I didn't say anything to that. I went back to camp, and I did the things that needed doing. Clara's child came on the 48th night. I know it was the 48th because I'd been keeping count. Not deliberately. Just the way you keep certain counts without meaning to, the way you notice how many days since rain, how many mornings since you slept through the night. 48 days since I found her at the base of the cottonwood. 2 strikes and Winona and Hanska were with her. I was outside. The wind had gone quiet, which sometimes happens in the middle of a hard winter, a stillness between storms that feels like the land breathing out. The stars were very bright. The kind of night where sound carries strangely and you can hear things far away that you normally wouldn't. I heard the baby cry. It was a small sound, thin and new and absolute. One of those sounds that has nothing before it, that is the first of its kind. I stood in the cold and I heard it, and I put my hand against the side of my tipi and I stood there. Hanska came out after a while and she told me, "A boy, healthy. Good lungs," she said, and she almost smiled when she said it. She looked at me in a way she doesn't often look at me. We have known each other our whole lives, she and I, and we do not need to say most things. She looked at me and she didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "He looks strong." I asked about Clara. She said, "She is tired, she is well." I nodded. Hanska started to go back in and then she stopped and turned to me and she said, "Lakota, she is asking for you." I said she should rest. Hanska said, "She is asking for you." The way she said it the second time was different from the first time, so I went in. The fire was low and the light was amber and close. Clara was lying on the robes with the baby against her chest, just a wrapped bundle, that particular bundle shape that is a new person. She looked at me when I came in and she looked, not the way she'd looked when she first woke up, which had been careful and watchful and scared underneath the surface. She looked like something had finished, like a thing that had been held at a very high tension for a very long time had finally been set down. I sat down near her, not close, at the respectful distance. She said, "Would you like to see him?" I said yes. She held him out and I looked. Dark eyes, the way newborns always are. A face still finding out what it was going to be. He was looking up at the smoke hole the way his mother had looked at it when she first woke up, and I thought, this one is going to be a person who watches the sky. Clara said, "I don't know what I'm going to do." I said, "You don't have to know yet." She said, "I have nowhere to go back to." I said, "I know." She said, "I don't know how to." She stopped. She said, "I don't know how to say what I want to say." I said, "Take your time." She looked at the baby for a while. Outside the tipi the camp was quiet, just the usual night sounds: a dog, the creak of cold wood, the distant sound of the wind over the hills. After a while she said, "My mother used to say there are 2 kinds of men in the world. Men who see what's in front of them and step around it, and men who see what's in front of them and stand in front of it. She said you could go your whole life and never meet the second kind." She was quiet, I was quiet. She said, "I have spent my whole life around the first kind." She looked up at me then, really looked, not the watchful, careful look, the other one, the one underneath. She said, "You stood in front of it. You stood in front of everything that was coming and you didn't step to the side and you didn't make me feel like something you'd done a favor for. You just stood there." I didn't say anything. She said, "I want to know why." I said, "I told you, you were in the snow." She said, "That's not all of it." I looked at the baby. He had closed his eyes. She shifted him slightly, just a small adjustment, the way you do when you've already learned someone's weight. I said, "No, it's not all of it." She waited. I said, "I have been chief of this band for 11 years. I have made decisions in that time that I knew were right and some that I only knew later were right and some I don't know about yet. What I know is this: when you know what you are, you don't need the world to agree with you. You just do what you are. I found you in the snow. I know what I am." Those two things went together. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said very quietly, "I know what you are too." And then she reached out and she put her hand on my arm. Just her hand on my forearm through the sleeve of my shirt. Not a grip, just a resting. The way you put your hand on something solid when the ground has been unsteady, and you need to feel what's real. She held it there a moment. Her eyes didn't waver. Then she said, "I want to stay. If that's I want to stay here with him. I want to learn. I want to be," she searched for the word. She said, "useful. I want to be useful here." I said, "You already are." She almost smiled. Not quite, she was too tired for quite, but almost. I looked at the baby again. He had the expression newborns have when they're dreaming, whatever newborns dream about. I said, "What will you call him?" She said, "I don't know yet." She looked at me. She said, "Is there a word in your language for someone who stands?" I thought about it. I said, "Natan." It means he who stands firm. She said it quietly to herself. Natan. Then she said, would it be right for me to call him that?" I said, "I think it would be right." She nodded. She looked down at him again and she said his name once more, just to herself. Natan. I got up. She was getting heavy with sleep and the baby was down and 2 strikes would want the space quiet. I moved toward the entrance and she said, "Lakota." I stopped. She said, "Thank you isn't enough, I know that, but I don't have another word for it yet." I said, "You'll find one." She stayed. I don't think she decided it the way you decide most things, sat down and waited out and came to a conclusion. I think she just never left, and the not leaving became the decision. By the time the snow broke and the passes were open again and she could have gone, there was nowhere she wanted to go to. What I know is that by the second spring she was speaking the language well enough that she didn't need me to translate anymore. And by the third winter she knew more about the preparation of certain medicines than some of the younger women, because she'd spent that time sitting with 2 strikes and asking him questions, and he'd discovered she was the kind of person worth answering. He doesn't talk to many people that much. He started talking to her. I noticed. The boy Natan grew the way boys do, fast and then faster, always surprising you. He had his mother's gray eyes and something in him that was entirely his own. A quickness, a way of going still when he was thinking that was almost unsettling in a young child. He was walking at 10 months and talking before most children his age, and he asked questions in 3 languages by the time he was 4, mixing them together as if the ideas didn't care which words they used. 2 strikes took an interest in him early. Said the boy had the kind of mind that needed unusual things to work on, or it would turn in on itself. I watched Natan grow, and I watched his mother in the camp, and I watched the camp around them both, and what I saw over those years was something I'd known but hadn't quite believed when I was standing in the snow that first night, that a person earns their place not by arrival but by return, by coming back every day, by doing the thing in front of them and then the next thing. Clara did that, quietly and without ceremony and without ever asking to be acknowledged, and the camp came to know what she was. Straight Beau's wife brought her a pair of winter moccasins at the beginning of the 4th winter. Didn't make an announcement of it, just set them down. Clara looked at them and then looked at Straight Beau's wife, and there was nothing said, because there didn't need to be. There was a night in that 4th year when I came back late from riding the eastern boundary. We'd had trouble with some men from outside the territory, men who weren't from the settlement, who thought the land here was unclaimed. And Clara was sitting outside my tipi when I came in, which was unusual. She didn't generally come to my tipi at night. She stood up when she heard me coming. She looked at me the way you look at someone when you've been thinking something and you've decided to say it. She said, I heard about the men in the East. I said, it's handled. She said, are you all right? I said, I'm fine. She said, Chayton said there were 7 of them. I said there were. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I need you to know something. I said, all right. She said, when I think about what would happen to this camp, to Nathan, to Winona and Hanska and 2 strikes and all of it, if something happened to you. She stopped. She said, I need you to know that I think about that it's not nothing to me. I looked at her. She was standing in the cold without a coat, which she still forgot sometimes even after 4 years. She'd just walk out because there was something she needed to say, and the coat didn't occur to her. I went inside and I got her coat and I came back out and I held it up and she put her arms into it with the automatic ease of someone who has had this done for them before, and she pulled it around herself and she looked at me. She said, I mean that you matter to this place and to me. I said, I know. She said, do you? I looked at her for a moment, then I said, yes, I do. She nodded. She went back to her tippy. I stood outside for a while in the cold after she'd gone and I looked at the sky, which was clear and tremendous, the way it gets on the coldest nights, everything very far away and very bright. I went inside and I slept well. There is one more thing I want to tell you. The summer Nathan turned 12, a man came through from the east, a traveler not from the settlement farther east than that, a man who'd been moving through the territory for some time. He came in peace, asked to water his horses, and I sat with him for a while as you do. He was a talker. Some men are. He told me about the settlement to our east, which I hadn't heard much of lately. Said the preacher there had died fever 3 winters back. Said the man named Deacon Marsh had lost his ranch to debt and moved on. Nobody quite knew where. Said the settlement itself had thinned out, families leaving one by one when the land didn't give what they'd expected. He said, you know that country. I said, somewhat. He said, ever hear of a woman named Clara Marsh? They say she ran off years back, Deacon's wife. I said, I can't say I have. He nodded, not particularly interested either way. He was already moving on to some other piece of news. I sat with him a while longer and then he rode on east, and I went back into camp. Clara was near the cook fair. Nathan was with her, showing her something he'd found, a feather, blue-black, from some large bird. She was turning it in her fingers and saying something to him, and he was nodding the way he does when he's already thought of the next question. She looked up and saw me. I don't know what was in my face. Something, apparently. She handed the feather back to Nathan and said something to him, and he went off at a run the way 12-year-olds do, total commitment, no transition, and she looked at me. She said, what is it? I told her, not all of it, just the parts that mattered. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the fire. Then she looked back at me and she said, is that all? I said, that's all. She nodded. She was quiet a moment more. Then she said, good. Just that, good. She looked at the fire a while longer and then she started talking again about something in the camp. Something about the supply of certain roots 2 strikes needed. I don't remember exactly, and that was the end of it. I have thought about that moment many times since, about the smallness of it, the way the past can come riding up and you can look at it and say good and turn back to the fire and go on with what you were doing. That is what a woman who has built her life from scratch can do. She knows the difference between what is over and what is not. She doesn't drag the over things into the not over things. She keeps them separate and she tends to what's in front of her. I have tried to learn that from her. I don't know that I've fully managed it, but I've tried. That was many years ago now. Longer than I'm going to count for you. Long enough that Nathan is grown, he has his mother's gray eyes, and he has something in the set of his jaw that I recognize but don't have a name for, something that is just his own. He rides well. He listens well. He asks good questions. He is going to be a good man. Clara stayed. She learned the language, really learned it, the way you learn a thing when you need it for your life. She became a person in this camp who is known for what she is, the same way anyone becomes known for what they are over time, by doing it again and again until it needs no explanation. She and I, we are not what the men of the settlement assumed we were. We are also not something I have a clean word for in any language. We have been sitting across fires from each other for years now, and we have said things to each other that you only say to someone you trust entirely, and we have made decisions together about this camp, the way you make decisions with someone whose judgment you have staked things on. What that is, I leave to other people to name. What I know is this. I know what I am. I knew it that night by the cottonwood in the snow when I put my hand against her throat and felt that thin thread of a pulse. I knew what kind of man I was going to be in the next few minutes, and I was that man. And everything that came from it, every cold night of standing in front of something that needed standing in front of, every decision made clear and clean, every morning in this camp with my people around me, and that woman in the camp who named what I was to her with her hand on my arm and her eyes steady. All of it came from that. Being the Rock is not a glamorous thing. It doesn't come with ceremony. Most of the time nobody sees it. You just hold. You hold the weight of the people who need holding. You stand in front of the things that need standing in front of. You make the decisions that need making without flinching and without needing anyone to thank you for it. And then sometimes, not always, and you can't count on it, and a man who does it for the thanks has the wrong idea about the whole thing, but sometimes a good woman puts her hand on your arm in the amber light of a low fire with her newborn child against her chest, and she looks at you steady and she says, "I know what you are." And you realize that being known, really known, by one person who has every reason to see you clearly and chooses to, that is the whole of it. The smoke hole is dark now. The camp has been quiet for a long time. Shunka is standing easy in the enclosure. The storm that was coming has passed over to the south. Tomorrow will be cold and clear, and there will be work to do. I sleep better these days than I have in years.